This is a mini lecture for activity number 3, focusing on chapter 5 of the mating game, titled Queering Courtship. Chapter 5 talked a lot about ideas of what queer relationships are, how they work, as well as some people's experiences with queer relationships. On page 107, this chapter opens up with a story about how Alec, a 38-year-old gay cis man, and what he thinks about heterosexual relationships, as well as what he thinks queer relationships are about, which, from reading this chapter, I think is one of the main and core ideas of this chapter. A specific quote that stood out to me was, he referred to queer relationship practices as both more interesting and inspiring than the tomb of the traditional family. Now, I interpret Alex's idea as queer relationships break the heterosexual relationship mold and sort of branch out into their own ideals and practices within queer relationships. I think that the tomb of the traditional family part of that is referring to people in what some may refer to as typical heterosexual relationships. A second main idea chapter 5 discusses is what queerness is and what it really means. On page 109, in the Making Their Own Rules section, one specific quote and main idea really that stood out to me was, for many, queerness is about making life choices distinct from those considered more socially expected, celebrated, and sanctioned. Now, I think that this really does relate back to the first main idea that I discussed, and it really reinforces it here in that people who are queer, identify as queer, really try their best to resist what most people would deem as normal, whether it be in their lives in general or in queer people's relationships. An idea that is also discussed on page 109, I think, stems from the idea of queer people resisting normal life practices, and that idea is how queer people choose to identify themselves. According to this book, most people would rather identify themselves as queer rather than gay, lesbian, or bisexual. The people who choose to identify themselves as queer thought that it was more of a progressive and inclusive identity that they wanted to go by. I was also able to learn that queer people are often attracted romantically to a wide range of gender identities, as well as not fitting themselves into the status quo. Queer people often recognize that there is more than just men and women when it comes to gender identities, which is why some people who identify as queer find themselves dating a wide array of people. Now, to switch gears a little bit, a third main idea that stuck out to me when reading this chapter was the topic of LGBTQ people and sex in the Reimagining Sex section of this chapter, starting on page 125. One quote that stuck out to me was the opening sentence of this section. Rather than regulate their sex lives with guidelines, most LGBTQ people focused on having sex when the time felt right, or simply because they wanted to have sex. This idea is both in terms of casual sexual encounters as well as having sex within the relationship. This to me stands out as another practice that LGBTQ people do in order to step away from the traditional stereotypes, and it is to have sex on their own terms and not when you're supposed to have sex. Another idea to relate to this that I found interesting was that there is less stigma around LGBTQ people having sex. I'm wondering why that's the case, when there's less stigma, though, based on what someone's gender identity and or sexual orientation is. What I think is really cool, and honestly something that everyone should be doing, is that LGBTQ people typically judge their partners less for their past sexual behaviors. In my opinion, no one should be judged for that, because everyone's experiences in life and relationships are different. Overall, from reading Chapter 5 of The Mating Game, I was able to learn about what queerness is and how queer people interact in life as well as within their relationships. As I had stated, one of the major aspects that I learned about as well was what it looks like as far as having sex in LGBTQ relationships. Overall, this was an interesting chapter that I learned a lot from.